Military personnel can often suffer from PTSD, especially after numerous tours abroad, but our feathered friends may provide some help to those in need. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. 18-year-old Patrick Bradley enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1967 as the Vietnam War was escalating. Afterward, he suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, almost going to prison. But it was in the Canadian forest for a study of bald eagles that he finally began to find peace. His story is the subject of a new book entitled The Eagle on My Arm, How the Wilderness and Birds of Prey Saved a Veteran's Life. It's co-authored by Terry Bibbins and Dava Guerin, and we have Dava on the phone this morning. Welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you, Don. Happy to be here.
So, first of all, how did you come about to write this book about this veteran?
Interestingly, Patrick Bradley was one of the subjects of a book that we did previously called Vets and Pets about 2 years ago. And his story was really compelling because when we were trying to find veterans who have found animals who have helped them heal, usually you think of service dogs or other animals similar to that. But then I happened to come across, I just Googled, just different kinds of animals that have helped veterans, came across Patrick Bradley's story, and it was so compelling that we put it in our first book. But what happened was, and it was interesting, when we were in Maine in Kennebunkport at President Bush 41 and Barbara Bush's home, because they were generous enough to let us have both our book launches there, one of the heads of the Army book program, Joe Craig, met Patrick and was very inspired by him and his story in the book. And he basically said, listen, if you'd be willing to write a book proposal just about him, I will help you try to get a publisher, and we'd love it to be part of our Army book program. And that's sort of how it came about, where we decided that his story was so rich and interesting and unique that it really deserved a book on its own.
So describe for me the home life that he grew up in.
Interestingly, Patrick grew up in a military family. I think every living relative male was in the Army. And so this is all he knew. And he often said when he was a child, all he wanted to do was to enlist in the Army. And, of course, his parents wanted him to start college first, but he couldn't wait. He was so impatient. And he enlisted and went to Vietnam and, of course, excelled in everything because by the time he was in basic training, he already knew how to do everything because of his dad and his relatives. So he began his career and at 18 was sent to Vietnam.
So what was that experience like? I understand he has very great difficulty talking about it, but from what you know, what happened to him?
Well, it's like so many people who were in Vietnam, it was a very difficult war. He was a special operator, a Green Beret, and one of the things that he was responsible for was to find POWs and try to release them in North Vietnam, sorry. And so he was dealing with very, very bad actors in very tough situations. He had seen so many difficult battles. He himself had just a lot of death and horror around him. And he's a very interesting, sensitive, very bright man. And I think, like many men his age, held everything in and didn't even know that he had a problem. And so what happened when he was injured, and he was injured in Vietnam, he was taken to Walter Reed, and he had all of these rage issues that came out of nowhere. And back then they didn't really know about PTSD, and they would call it shell shock or other things, but people really didn't understand it. And so when he was in the hospital, they wanted to amputate his hand, and that would have been horrible for him because he's a falconer, he loved birds, that's the last thing he ever wanted to have happen. And one of the doctors suggested that, and it just sent him into a rage. And he literally punched his superior officer, and he broke his jaw, which was not a good thing. No, not good. And so that happened, and of course, they didn't know what to do with him. And but it happened a second time, and this was now way more serious. The same doctor came back in, recommended the same treatment, and he went berserk, literally punched him again, broke his jaw again, and they were like, whoa, we have to do something with you. And they were going to send him to Leavenworth, but his father at the time was an Army colonel, and others who knew him knew that his life was worth saving and to try to find an alternative for him so that he could manage his rage and somehow be rehabilitated without going to prison.
So he eventually winds up in the study, as we indicated, in the Canadian forest. And in the book, I believe it says that in the woods, you lose all sense of time and simply live moment to moment. The days were all the same, but each one became an adventure in and of itself. What do you think in that experience began to turn him around, or at least begin to deal with the kind of stress that he obviously had from Vietnam?
Well, Patrick is a survivor, and of course, being in Vietnam and his training, he knew how to survive, and his doctor found a grant for him to study and count bald eagles in the wild for 3 years all by himself in the Canadian wilderness. And so it was a wonderful experience for him. In the beginning, it was a little weird. Like he explained to you, you're dropped off in the middle of nowhere, but he loved the experience because he was surrounded by all of this beauty, even though it was freezing and he had to survive and figure out what to eat and how to cover himself. And, but the experience of just being alone, listening to the sounds of nature, and then counting these amazing, majestic birds in the wild, for him really became a healing experience. And he had no one. There was literally no one he spoke to. I think he probably, on a satellite phone, talked to a few people just to get supplies dropped every so often, but just being around all of these amazing creatures. And then he had some harrowing stories. He had to run away from bears and, all kinds of crazy stuff. But every time something happened, he found another relief from his stress. And even at night, he would say, he would hear the sounds of nature, and it would calm him down because he had to think about why he was so angry, what was going on, and that process of thinking and being alone really, really helped to calm him down.
Do you think that, by the way, that in terms of that experience, that in some ways that nature was a bit of a soothing diversion from these thoughts that, if you're trapped in your own thoughts, they can become circular?
Oh, absolutely. And now there's so much research about nature therapy, ecotherapy, and some people are even using it as a treatment for PTSD, which, later on you'll find out how Patrick discovered that. But he found that just by being in his own thoughts and having the solitude, his nightmares, his night terrors, decreased. And happy thoughts started to creep in. He wrote music. He was literally writing music because he heard all these sounds and he loves music. So he was writing songs in his head and, writing things down. And the experience for him was absolutely life-changing. They did not want to let him out of Walter Reed unless he were being put in prison because they were afraid that he was a danger to himself or others. And that's how bad he was from his experience in Vietnam. So being in the wilderness like that just had that amazing healing effect.
So he emerges from the Canadian forest and he really begins a career in training wild animals. How does it come about? How did he begin to move from one step to the next there?
Well, the first thing that happened, and it's so interesting to read, to learn about all his adventures in the forest, which, if you read the book, they're just so fascinating and funny. Some of them are funny. But when he was picked up on the plane to go back, literally the only thing in his mind was getting a cheeseburger. That's all he wanted. Because he was eating bugs and, little cooked animals and all kinds of gross things, which, for most people wouldn't sound great. But he didn't lose a pound when he went in there. I forgot what his weight was, maybe 170. He came out literally the same amount of weight. But all he wanted was a cheeseburger. So once he got that out of the system, it was wonderful. He went back home. He went back to school. He got his bachelor's degree. He decided that he wanted to get a master's. He got his master's degree in zoology. And then he just decided he wanted a career in, working with animals. And this began this crazy journey all over the country where he, because of his expertise, he was able to do shows. He would go into schools. He had an agent, And he did many different types of shows in the beginning of his career, where he would have like the animals that are disgusting and nobody wanted to even go near or touch, like a snake or a tarantula. And he would go all over the country educating young people about the importance of preservation and conservation of wildlife. He also became an expert trainer, so he trained bears and cougars and all kinds of wild animals for television, for movies, commercials, and was really well known in the industry as like one of the top trainers. So he, got that expertise, and then that led him to theme parks where he would run wild animal shows. And people would come, kind of like you would go to now, and they would take a little boat ride, and they would see Patrick on a big dock with a cougar or another wild animal, and then he would talk about the animal, and then he would do different things with them because he trained them, and he trained them from babies, so they were domesticated. And people loved it, and they learned so much from Patrick, and that sort of began his career, working with all wild animals and birds of prey.
So he seems to go then, obviously, from reptiles to, I've done my notes to red-tailed hawks. Tell me a little bit about that, and Thorin in particular, I guess, who was originally crazy.
Oh, that is, crazy. He has, it's funny in the book, and it was great to write this, and Terry, my late husband, and I wrote this together, that in the book also you learn so much about individual birds and animals and their personalities. So the birds of prey, and also some of the bears like Mandy and the bald eagles, you're going to really learn about them as individuals. So that's the fun part, to see how they actually have personalities, they have feelings. You would never imagine that, but they really do. And Crazy, which he named Thorin from Lord of the Rings, was this hawk that nobody thought was trainable. And they said, all right, you take it because it's the toughest one, and you work with this bird. Well, they were inseparable. It was a love affair. It is the most beautiful story. I don't know if I want to tell people the ending, because it's just a beautiful story with this bird. But essentially, eventually, he did release, because the idea is, if a bird is releasable, that's the goal, is to get them back into the wild. But he had a love affair with this hawk for years until he released her, and the rest, you have to read the book to find out the love story with this bird. But that's just one of many of Patrick's relationships with very difficult birds who've had a rough time. They're either shot by horrible human beings who, are shooting them with guns or BB guns or whatever crazy things, or they are just rehabilitated because somebody hit them, or they have a medical disorder. But every bird that Patrick, or wild animal that he has worked with, it's a love story, and I think that's the real beauty of Patrick's story.
Do you think there's a connection then between the wounds he suffered on the one hand, both obviously psychologically, but also physically as well, and the fact that these birds, often that he loved, were also harmed in some way?
Yeah, and that, to me, is another fascinating element which I've learned about. In the very beginning, when I first began to interview Patrick, it was hard to understand how could a wounded bird of prey on your arm on a glove change a veteran's life? How can it make somebody who has very bad PTSD get better? And I couldn't understand it. Finally, it hit me after he explained the biofeedback element of it. And especially for wounded warriors, or really for anybody, but let's say for wounded warriors, they are sort of the apex predators of us, in a sense. They're top of the food chain. They're warriors. And the birds of prey, apex predators who are wounded, they both share something where the veteran can see in this bird the brilliance, the sharpness, the ability to be able to get prey and to go after them. But when a bird of prey is wounded, it's just like a wounded warrior. They're beaten, they're hurt, and there is a relationship between them, which is a biofeedback mechanism. And Patrick explains this a lot in the book, where when you're holding a wounded bird of prey on your arm with a glove, you have to be very calm yourself. You have to take deep breaths. You need to be so quiet, because if you show any fear or anxiety, that bird is going to pick it up and it's going to want to get away from you really quickly. So they are trained. When Patrick first approached the Bay Pines VA hospital, when he realized that this could be a really good therapy, they came out and they realized, oh, this could really work. And then that's sort of what began this involvement, actually through his son walking with the wounded hawk on his arm, that he began to see this odd phenomenon that people were actually getting better just from this experience.
I was going to ask you about it. It was Schuyler, I guess, who joined the Army, and he apparently he did not talk about his experiences, or not the real experiences, right? He kind of kept it at bay, but it seemed to then come to emerge, as it were, as his own PTSD began to emerge after he got back from the tours.
Yeah, and Patrick saw that and was extremely concerned. Schuyler had many, many issues that were real big red flags for Patrick, and there are a few scenes in the book where his son was brandishing a gun, and some scary moments. He actually shot in the house, and luckily it only hit the couch, but
Right.
and not a human, but that was a good thing. But it concerned him so much that he just said to his son, "Look, just come to the park." At that point, Patrick was managing a bird of prey program at two different parks, one in Boyd Hill, the other in Largo, the Narrows, and he asked him to come and just take a walk with a wounded burn on his arm, and he did. And Patrick began to see very slowly that Schuyler was doing much better. Both Schuyler, by the way, and his dad were falconers, so the birds were always in their lives. But he did see a result, and that's what gave him the idea, wait a minute, maybe I should go to the VA hospital and suggest this as part of their recreational therapy to bring wounded warriors to the park, to the Narrows, and that's how the program, the Avian Veteran Alliance, actually began, by him just seeing this result in Schuyler, knowing, of course, what it did for him, and then it began this amazing journey that he's had.
Now, it not only affected people who were obviously in the military and suffered, but you also saw the transformation in a number of people who came to the place where he worked. One, I guess, is Telia's, transformation. Tell me a little bit about that.
Telia's story, that's the other thing about writing this book that was just, well, for us, it was just wonderful, because not only did we write Patrick's story, but within the book, the stories of the people who, and there were many, many, many more, we couldn't put them all in, but of the people who had really dramatic results, who were healed, and then the stories about the birds, the relationships that they had. Telia was a mess. I mean, he just was a complete mess. He was inpatient at Bay Pines. He was suicidal. He didn't, and I believe, I don't know if we put this in 100% of the book, but he didn't go out of his apartment, and I believe it was for 8 months, literally, except to get food. And it was so bad that one day he had a gun and he was ready to shoot himself. And luckily, somebody, he got some help. He was admitted, and he came to the park with Patrick, was very not communicative, very quiet. But Patrick noticed something in him, as he always does. He's very intuitive, and he just picks up things with people. And he just saw, wow, this guy's something special. And so he started talking to him. He gave him a small, you always start out with a small bird. I actually took a walk with a little cute screech owl, Lucy. So he started out with a little bird, and then gradually Telia was able then to work with the owls, the hawks, eventually Sarge the bald eagle. And I'm telling you what, and Teal, you can see it in the book, and Telia's everywhere on Facebook as well, his story. But he talks about this, and it's unbelievable. He was in the depths of the worst depression because of going to the park for about a year, and then after he was discharged, he kept coming back. Patrick relied on him as one of his best volunteers. Telia went back to school, got his undergraduate degree. He's now a teacher. I think he's almost engaged. He is doing so well, you would not know this was the same person, just by this experience.
Because one of the things that I thought was funny was that when he first went out there, and he says, the reason I didn't come back right away is that you told us to go and get lost in the park, so that's what I did. And apparently they had to go out and find him.
They did. There were some funny things like that, absolutely, because, he just took it literally, And he was so immersed in the experience that he just didn't want, nobody does. And I know I've done it. When you're out there and you're walking with this beautiful bird, and you can see it's crazy, but these are animals that typically don't want to be around people. But because they've been socialized, they're injured, they're taken care of, you can see in a sense that they need the people, and the people need them. So I think that's the beauty of it. And not just for wounded warriors. It was a gentleman named Steve. He was a veteran, but I think he owned a design firm, and he had Parkinson's disease. And his wife brought him to the park. He was not communicative at all. I don't think he spoke for about a year. He was in hospice. And but he was a falconer previously. And as soon as Patrick met him and put a hawk on his arm, unbelievable. Steve started talking, not a lot, but he talked to Patrick. He lived for another year, and he was the happiest that he ever was.
To focus in on this impact that these birds have, you tell a story about Sarge and a woman's trembling hand. Tell us a little bit about that and how it sort of miraculously happened.
Well, it's funny. There are many stories with Sarge, because Sarge, you'd have to meet her, and if you met her, and there's another eagle in the book, Thunder, as well. They're amazing creatures, and they have this power, perhaps because most of us have never been up close and personal to a bald eagle, but because Patrick worked with both of these birds, Sarge, for a long time, Sarge's impact on people is unbelievable. You're not really supposed to touch a bald eagle, technically. When they go out and they do programs, really you don't want to do that. However, there are those occasions where somebody just, you can see, or they can see that this person would super benefit from that. And there have been a couple of cases where Patrick and or Rhea, who's another one of, in the book, a wonderful woman, it's also one of Sarge's handlers, had some experiences where, people were allowed to do that just quickly. And for one person whose hand was trembling, it was a woman, for that moment that she was taking a walk with that bird, when she came back, her hand was not trembling as she was walking with that bird.
So describe some of the birds for them. I mean, in terms of personalities, I had Shay, Dakota. I think you had a couple of birds that didn't like each other and wound up being fast mates, I guess. It's almost like a love story.
Ricky and Lucy, let me tell you about Ricky and Lucy. Barbara Bush and President Bush 41, I've known them since they were in the White House, and I would actually say they were my heroes next to my parents. And we've always been, I've always been involved in some way with them and their chief of staff, Jean Becker, who's this amazing woman. Anyway, they both wrote forwards to both previous books. We did the book launches of Vets and Pets and our other book at their house in Maine. So Patrick and T and Kaylee agreed to come up because Patrick was in that book, the first book, and we were going to bring, and the Bushes wanted us to bring all these service dogs and animals. So one of the people in the book brought a pot-bellied pig, and there were dogs, and you name it. Well, Patrick, of course, has to bring two screech owls that were both imprinted to humans. They weren't wounded, but they could not be around other owls. And Ricky and Lucy, were in the Narrows in separate habitats. You could not have them together because Lucy was imprinted to humans and Ricky was with his other little buddies. So you could not have these two together at all. It was not doable. Anyway, they brought them to Maine, and they were in the car for hours and hours together. And then when they were in the hotel and they were busy doing things, they were together. So Patrick brought Lucy and Ricky, and Telia was there, and Kaylee, to the Bush's house. It was hysterical. And President Bush wasn't really feeling well, but he was amazing. He had to come down the long driveway with his aide and give every single wounded warrior a coin. It was such a beautiful sight. Honestly, I was almost in tears. It was that beautiful. But anyway, so we went back up, and Mrs. Bush was looking at Lucy and had Lucy on her arm. It was really sweet. And then Telia decided, all right, let's show President Bush Ricky. So anyway, he brought Ricky over to President Bush. Next thing you know, horror of horrors, Ricky had a humongous accident, and it went all over President Bush's pants. And of course, like, Patrick was horrified, and Mrs. Bush yells out, "Don't worry, he's got plenty of pants." And we were just like laughing. And anyway, the long story short of this is that when they got back, Lucy and Ricky were together all this time, and they went to put Lucy back in her habitat and Ricky back in his. Next thing you know, they're screaming for each other. Ricky is making all these, owls make these funny noises. It's hard to even do it, but Lucy was doing the same thing. And they just thought, all right, let's just see what's going on here. Patrick opened up the habitat. Ricky flew right into Lucy's cage, and they have been together since they're inseparable. So you tell me, that was such a sweet story.
Now, he also had, I guess, at least a couple of marriages. Tell me a little bit about that. And when you describe by the book that Patrick was a charming fellow. I mean, he wasn't, despite all of the things that he'd gone through, this did not necessarily keep him from that kind of social interaction.
No, Patrick struggled probably, and still does to a degree, but everything is so, in control. But when he was younger, even coming out of the wilderness, he would have, from his PTSD, because remember, it wasn't diagnosed. I don't think he was diagnosed until 1998, give or take. And he was not diagnosed with PTSD. So when he was married and he was young, these things would come out, and he was very difficult to deal with. So as a result, he had 2 failed marriages, and then he met his current, I don't know, I think they're married. Isn't that funny? I don't remember. But Carol, he's been together with her forever, and she is just an animal lover. They both met at a theme park, and he's great because he's able to control all of those things, because when he was finally diagnosed, he was treated. And thank goodness there's so much about PTSD now. The VA is working on helping veterans, and it's really more out there. It's hopefully the stigma is getting better, that people no longer realize it's not a terrible thing. It's just a mental health condition. And anybody who's been through a trauma, trust me, I know, or has been in any kind of combat situation is going to have some form of it. And I think that's why it's so interesting, because one thing with this book we really want is to give people hope. And I think one of the reasons why the Association of the Army wanted this to be part of their book program, and the University Press of Kentucky literally gave us a deal, because they loved this whole idea of not only just nature therapy and the story about all these different soldiers, but it's hopeful. And to know that, everybody can get better. And you can do it any way you want. You can do it, take a walk in a park, go to a theme park, take a walk with your dog. Just be in nature and deal with your demons, deal with the things that are bothering you, and you will hopefully, not for everybody, but hopefully you will live a much happier life. And Patrick is living proof of that. He is 72 years old. He was just 72. You would never know it. He volunteers when I first met him, I thought he was an employee. It turns out he's a volunteer, and he works, 60 hours a week. It's unbelievable because of his passion for these birds.
We've been speaking with Dava Guerin. She has co-authored a new book entitled The Eagle on My Arm, How the Wilderness and Birds of Prey Saved a Veteran's Life. And we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us this morning.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure, as always, Don.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.